So hello, this is Matthew. I'm going to quickly explain what the library management system does, how I tested with JUnit, show some of my tests, run them live, and then show the coverage report after. So this is the main library management system. It creates some sample books with users and then adds them to the library. This is the book class, stores the title, author, ISBN, and other book is available information. Then we have the user class, which stores user information like the name, ID, and the list of borrowed books. And then we have the library class, which manages the collection of books and the users and handles operations like adding books, borrowing, returning. So the overall logic is the user borrows books from the library, books switch between available and unavailable, and both the user and the library track the borrowed books. So for testing, I created a separate test folder. It was the same format as the source and a project folder underneath. And so I wrote 3 tests: a book test, library test, a user test, library integration test, and then an overall test suite, one just to test each file, and then a suite to run them all at once. And so we'll go with the user test first. In user test, I used before each to create a fresh user and book before every test so they don't interfere. I used an after each so that it cleans up the objects afterwards. I used assert equals here to check the user's name and ID, and assert not null to make sure the borrows book is listed and initialized. Some other tests I wrote were that I used assert true, assert equals, assert same, and to basically just check the behavior when a borrowed book is borrowed or not. And yeah, I used assert that also in the Hamcrest example, which matches the assignment requirement you wrote. And then move on to the library integration test. This class contains the integration tests using the DU, or definition use idea from the class. So one example is a user.borrowBook and a library.addBorrowBook. So you see a user.addBook, a library.borrowBook. So I create a user, a book, and a library, then have the user borrow the book and check that both the user and the library are updated correctly. Another example is returning the book. So we do library return book, library.user.borrowBook, and the integration test basically verifies the book becomes available again and is removed from the borrow list after. And then some other ones that test each of the functions shown in the library management system test. So, and then I wrote the same thing for a library test. Again, you use the same before each, after each setup. You used all the assertions that were mentioned in the prompts, like assert equals assert that, to make sure that the library actually updates when the book's borrowed and when it's returned. And the same thing with the user test as well, making sure creating some users before and cleaning up after to make sure that, again, the users are updated and actually correspond to the borrowed book. And so I'm going to just run, since we have our test suite here, we're going to right click and then we're going to run it as a JUnit test. So when we run it, we see the results here. We can expand them as well. We see they all compiled here successfully. And so yeah, this just confirms that each of the tests were successful in the behaviors that I wrote with the original Java files that we were given. And so then the same thing with the test suite that runs all of the tests at once. We can right click and then we can run it as a coverage test. And the same thing we're going to see here, boom, each of them compiled and ran successfully based on the test we wrote. And then you can look down here, we have the coverage report. So when you look at the project of the test, you can see the coverage of each test. And you can see what each of the parts, or each of the tests, we can see that they all run 100% and verify that the all code coverage is valid. And so I got about 80% total coverage. So this means, I guess, that the most of the simple logic was tested. However, there were some edge cases that I realized after I could have covered, so that's probably why it's not 100% completely covered. And so you can actually export this with this little gear right here. I already have, but so when you export the coverage, you can come over and look at the test in a browser. So you have your test, you can click on the project, and you can click on each of the following test files that we wrote and see what each of them entailed. You can see the yellow highlights what was actually tested. Same for this one, here, and here. And yeah, that's the exported view, so you can get an idea of what happened, what failed, what succeeded, things like that for each of the following tests, and you can see your overall test coverage here. So I think 87% is pretty good. You can see how many misses we hear. So 11 misses, those are probably the edge cases that I missed. And then you also have your sessions, which is just basically the data for the execution of each of the JUnit tests, and then down here these connect right back to your test and coverage, and you can analyze them further. So that's pretty much it. That's kind of what I wrote. I had to install some extra jar files because Eclipse was having problems here. Some of the test cases I wrote, the asserts and JUnit, the JUnit assertion statements weren't being identified by Eclipse, so I had to add those in. But it's pretty much just the JUnit engine suite launcher jars that you need to actually run JUnit within Eclipse. So yeah, basically to summarize, I implemented the user test for the main classes, the integration test for the main library management system, and then created a test suite that covers them all. I forgot to mention I used EDEMA as the coverage explorer, so that was the one I chose. It was the most straightforward, and it was already built into Eclipse. The tests, I guess I'll confirm that the library management system behaves as it should. Some of the edge case scenarios, like I said, I missed some of those, so that would be something to go back and look at. But overall, the coverage showed that I had a pretty strong overall test cases and coverage for the library management system. So that's about it. Thanks.